and welcome to the Periphery from the Pulaski Institution. I'm your host, Alan Elrod, and our guest today is Craig Calhoun. Craig is University Professor of Social Sciences at Arizona State University. In the past, he was Director of the London School of Economics, President of the Social Science Research Council, founder of the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU, and he was also a professor at places like UNC-Chapel Hill, Columbia, and Princeton. He is also a member of our board here at Pulaski. I'm really wonderfully thrilled and honored that he's part of our organization. And we're going to be talking today about a lot of things, but in particular, we're going to be talking about his most recent book, Degenerations of Democracy, which he co-authored with Dilip, Parameshwar Gaonkar, and Charles Taylor. And Greg, I would say this is just a really great book. I loved it. And you know, I'm not just saying that because of the fact that I've been a big fan for a long time, or that you're part of Pulaski. It's really good. And also, I think it is so central to what we're really preoccupied with at Pulaski, which is in the book and this is where I think I might want to start us off, you elect to focus primarily on not backsliding democracies that are in transition, not sort of new democracies, but really on the deterioration of democracy in sort of advanced established democracies. And I think that's a cool place to start, sort of why you all chose that particular set of parameters. And then also, of course, I've been talking for a second. Go ahead and say hello and everything. But I'm interested to kick us off and sort of why, because I get asked that at Pulaski too, why pick these, why only focus on these kinds of democracies? And I think it's a good place to start our chat.
Well, Alan, I think that particular question is answered by saying that's the news of the moment. Democracy is always hard. It's hard to get off the ground. Democratic transitions are hard. So in various parts of the world, we've seen back and forth in many Latin American countries for 200 years, really exemplary democratic constitutions. In the early 19th century, efforts to get going, then caudillos or generals take over. And democracy has to get restarted, and that continues into the very recent past. What we are concerned about in this book is that there seems to be a process of degeneration in some of the long-established democracies that have seemed to be more stable, that have seemed to be models for other parts of the world. And we think that this should be getting a lot of concern too.
Yeah, I think this is the thing when we talk about some of these current democracies, especially when we're talking about something like the United States or Britain. There is that risk. Not even, I wouldn't say risk. I think constant, the pushback that some people give is, well, these places are still democracies, right? Like if you score them and some of these big national things, they still are among the world's most advanced democracies, right? There's all the kinds of basic sort of attributes or features that sort of democracy scholars look at and say, these are democracies. But I think that, and I mean, obviously, I think the thrust of the book is about this, that's kind of an insufficient way to talk about the problem, right? That there are enough things happening kind of under the hood here in these countries that should concern us. But I think, secondly, and this is the other thing you all lay out really well in the book, which is it's these kinds of talking about sort of full or flawed democracies in these sort of global scoring systems, et cetera, they give the impression that democracy is a kind of thing that you reach and then you're done. And that's an idea that is rejected consistently right throughout the book, that democracy is this thing that is a process that we become, not that we simply arrive at and sit at and remain static at. And I think yeah, I'm really interested because I think that in particular is such a good, I think, weigh in on this challenge where people might say, well, are you saying the U.S. isn't a democracy? And I think part of the answer to me that comes through in the book is, well, not exactly, but we are saying that there are faults in how it is operating as a democracy, and there are ways in which it is not becoming a better democracy in the moment.
Yeah, so I think that's right. That it's important to think not just of being a democracy, but as you say, becoming, and as we say in the book, trying to be better at it. And democracy is something you do, and you can do better. It's like saying somebody is a basketball player. Well, that might be true. I'm a basketball player. I'm not a very good one. I try to get a little bit better. The chance that I'm going to be able to help one of the teams in the NBA finals is really remote. And it should remind us that democracy, like other things that we do, is something that we can do better or worse. So when it comes to the various ways that we habitually talk globally, number one, the idea that a country just is a democracy or isn't is misleading. It's like you flip a light switch on or off, you're a democracy or not. The idea that there are a handful of key variables and that you can score democracies is better than that light switch on or off model, but it is still imperfect. As you say, it implies that there's sort of a ratchet effect, that once you get there, you won't slide back, and there are no guarantees of that. But also it implies that what democracy means is objective and fixed permanently. And we're at pains in this book to say that democracy is always open to improvement and always open to reimagining in a democratic way by the people who make the democracy. So Charles Taylor introduces a concept that we use throughout the book of saying that democracy itself is a telic concept, by which he means it's always a concept that incorporates some ideals that can't be fully met. And our point here is that whether you're talking about the United States or France or Britain or any of the world's major democracies now, the effort to become a democracy, right? The independence and constitution moment in the 18th century US, the post-colonial moment for India after World War II, incorporated ideals as well as objective facts. So there's a constitution, and there's a process of amending the Constitution, of reinterpreting it, of trying to do a better job living up to it. The US is founded very much as a republic with some limited democratic characteristics, right? So there's not full and free voting for all citizens, for example. The vote is restricted to adult white men with property. And so women are excluded, slaves are excluded. Most of the white men of the country are excluded at the outset. But incorporated into the democratic constitution is the potential for doing better and changing and deepening how we're democratic. And so we try to point to that process and say, okay, if you're serious about being a democracy and living in a democracy, you need to be serious about trying to make it a better democracy, about advancing it. If you try to stand still, or if you're too backward looking, that's when you set degenerations in motion. That's when you undermine the very project of being democratic.
Yeah, I think that's, I think even reading in the book in that section, there's a line in this most recent season of Succession, when they've got the kind of like crazy far right candidate that is potentially going to get elected, and the Swedish sort of media CEO guy who's looking to buy up the American company at the center of the show is talking to one of the Americans and says, she says, we'll figure this out essentially. And he goes kind of, yeah, but you've only been a democracy for like 50 years, right? And it's a joke that lands now, right, with us in the present. It's and that I think gets at that moving transition. People at the same time as all of those aspects of America sort of disenfranchising and oppressing and delegitimizing different groups are true, it is also this incredibly expansive electorate for the early 19th century. But a joke like "you've only been a democracy for 50 years" lands pretty well in 2023 to our sensibilities, because we look back and we go, uh, yeah, I mean, it was only not even really like a complete generation ago that we were sort of still barring certain people from participation, and that obviously rubs up on this idea of when your definition in America, and we weirdly struggle with this more in the United States, I think, because of the nature of our national myth versus the post-war constitutions that exist in Europe, which is constantly making recourse to what people meant when they talked about republicanism or democracy in the late 18th century, which is not an uninteresting conversation, but is maybe not the best roadmap for how to have a conversation for like how to sort of sort out debates about rights and freedoms in the 21st century.
Well, yeah, that's right. The world changes, and democracy needs to keep up. Let me give just an example that isn't given enough. I didn't invent this, other people have noticed it. But when the United States of America was launched in the late 18th century, a lot of observers thought it couldn't be a full democracy, and if it tried, it would collapse. Why? Because it was too big, right? Aside from all the other issues, aside from inequality, aside from education, aside from everything, it was too big. Well, it was tiny by comparison to the United States today. And the growth in scale changes what it takes for democracy to work. There are some technological and other advances that help us cope with that. So we get new media, right? We get a growth of new kinds of newspapers. We then get radio and television. We get social media. And we are able to deal better with the communicative requirements of a larger democracy than we could without those media. All right, we can't have a town hall meeting for 300 million people. We kind of pretend we have town hall meetings on TV that have a couple hundred people in a room and a few thousand people watching them, but they aren't the same thing as a town hall meeting in a small town. So the scale of the society changing puts different pressures on democracy, and we find ways to respond, like new media. And each of these responses opens a can of worms. It has some problems of its own. So we're not totally happy with the response, and we try to improve on it. So we build big newspapers, and we get so-called yellow journalism, a lot of scandal sheets. We get people making up some of the stories, and we try to professionalize journalism to make it serve democracy better. But then the media changes, and the old newspapers, which used to be in every major city of the country, get bought up by chains or closed down, replaced by television, then replaced in turn by new electronic media in our current era. And each of these changes offers new potential, but also undercuts the way in which we tried to secure better communication before. And it's not just communication, it's not just scale. Those are examples of the fact that a changing world calls for democracy to keep changing in various ways. Let me just give you one other related example. At the time of its founding, the US is overwhelmingly agricultural. We are still working through a long story of becoming a country in which a tiny percentage of our population actually works in farming. An even smaller percentage owns their farms as family farmers. So we have a self-image that's a little bit out of date, in which there are a lot more people in rural America living rural lives rather than living in rural places and commuting to someplace else to work or ordering from Amazon. And that too is a challenge for democracy, right? We're an overwhelmingly urban and suburban nation. We still have small towns. We still have rural areas. We don't always do right by them, but they aren't the majority the way they used to be. And so democracy has to continue to be reworked and thought through and changed in order to continue to be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, when the people live in these very different circumstances.
I think one of the things I love about talking about media and all of this is the way it brings forward both the incredible rapidity of change. Obviously, things are very different now. Social media and the internet, and even older innovations like the telegraph and telegram rapidly changed the way people communicate and think. But I also love the way it brings forward some of the similarities and some of the kind of constants in human nature and in political societies that are built around people, right? Because political journalism was really hacky in the late 18th century, right? There were attack dogs with highly partisan. Like you said, we professionalized journalism, and we talked today about a kind of sort of, I think, degeneration in journalism in terms of the deprofessionalization and some of the not just amateurism but also partisanship. But before it was professionalized, it was also pretty crazy and hectic and muddy and nasty. And so I think there's this interesting sort of two tracks there of both how much things can change and then also how some of these problems are incredibly recurring.
So I think there are, in almost every major change, there are potentials for things to go awry, and there are potentials to make things better. And you get always this mixture. It's very, very rare that you're getting anything and say, right, that was just pure progress. Nothing bad happened at all. So the pattern then, if you look over American history, is of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or 1 sideways, or maybe 3 steps back when you have to recover, right? It goes on. So at the time of the American founding, there was not really effective, widespread media reach to the whole country. And there was just the invention of things that would become modern newspapers and so forth. So there were pamphlets that would circulate widely. There were broadsides, these sheets of paper that had a lot printed on one facing of the page. So things like Thomas Paine's writings, his original Common Sense, were super bestsellers, but they only reached a fraction of the population. Ben Franklin is printing and is getting the word out. So we're just inventing the media that democracy needs at the same time that we're trying out large-scale democracy for the first time. On the good side, in that period, we have these remarkable edited projects like what we will know as now as the Federalist Papers, where there are essayists who are writing for publications that are reaching significant parts of the educated population, carrying out very high-level political debate that you would now find going on in seminar rooms of leading political science departments or something, but carrying it on in public, not just in universities, and engaging people who are not academics, who are part of the political process, but also part of agriculture and the economy and so forth. So you have a very high level of political essay, but you have problems with how widely it reaches. Then as you move through the history of all this change and the new technologies, you keep getting these sort of mixed benefits all the way through to social media. Social media has produced an opportunity for people to be their own producers and circulators of ideas, to be actively participants in the public sphere that didn't exist before. I mean, newspapers and TV are a kind of one-way communication. Some people make content and they send it to other people. Social media can be two-way, but it turns out it can also be hacked. It can also have bots that come in and send out messages. It can have an extremely widespread circulation of fake news that looks like it might be believable. So the good side tends to be skewed by the bad side in the social media equation right now. And I'll leave it to you to draw the conclusion about whether we're getting more good or more bad. But the point is, you never get all one or all the other. And so there's a learning process in which we learn to do better with the tools. We learn to make newspapers better over time before that model began to collapse economically for all but a few. Broadcast journalism brought in a new challenge of how do you clarify the distinction between news and entertainment? Well, that had been there in the older print journalism and had been sort of worked out, but it comes back in a big way. And the mixture of efforts to give factual reporting and efforts to do entertainment is sort of inevitable, but creates new challenges. We try to sort it out in various ways, but then they come undone as we move from being dominated by broadcast to a different mixture of media technologies. And so I think you're right to say there are constants that are almost human nature. You're right to say there are different particularities to every point, but there's also always a potential learning process. And part of democracy is joining in that learning process together of trying to make the technologies or the institutions work in our current circumstances. And that's never something that's settled. It's always something that can come unsettled again. And the speed of the change can itself be unsettling as people figure, okay, I've just about got email down, and email comes to be an old folks communication technology compared to new modes of texting and sending images and staying in touch.
I mean, I'm feeling that even in my early 30s, right? Like, I feel like I have a certain style of presentation down. I understand like Twitter pretty well. I watch other people make TikToks. I do not grasp a significant amount of what is being produced or how it's produced, and I would not.
This is true. I've never seen you dance, Alan.
My wife actually makes that complaint as well. To be fair, that's how we should promote Pulaski. Is just the endless stream of me dancing to various content. I think this is actually so the social media thing is so interesting to me. I want to pull it out.
Yep.
Even talking about dancing trends and some of this stuff is interesting because it gets at attention that I find fascinating with even another part of the book, which is in some ways, this moment has upended some of the challenges that we've had in our modern kind of, I guess, like, sort of post-war to now period of sort of the idea of American meritocracy. Because social media has allowed some people to bypass what used to be kind of the traditional ways of sort of quote unquote demonstrating your sort of talent or ability, et cetera. Those are not necessarily fair institutions, and we're both, I think, pretty aware of that, even especially in academia, right? They're not always particularly fair or unbiased assessments of a person's potential or ability. But the flip side is that we may not always like what people who get famous or who achieve success or who find ways to achieve significant social mobility through these new platforms. We may not always like exactly what it is they make in order to do that. So on the one hand, it's kind of great that people can forge these sort of new professions and get their voices heard who maybe never would have. On the other hand, many of the incentive structures run towards, on a good day, maybe kind of shallow entertainment. On a bad day, some pretty nefarious stuff, right? And that raises some issues about, I don't think quote unquote meritocracy is good in the way that you're talking about in the book, or the way we understand it as a kind of false sense of egalitarianism, where actually not everybody can rise to the top. But on the other hand, the lack of gatekeepers, the fact that anyone kind of can create content and anyone kind of can build a career on some of these platforms sort of reminds us in a way why it actually is good to have some of these processes in place, because not everyone goes about that in a way that is ethical or helpful or even safe for the wider public.
Yeah, I would just say that the idea of meritocracy has become a sort of ideology that benefits some and harms others, doesn't mean that there's nothing like quality and differences in quality of performance. It means the idea of meritocracy may be not very helpful in putting our finger on how that works. So whether you're talking about people and how they get access to communication or get selected to have a bigger voice, or you're talking about ideas and which ones get taken up, or you're talking about the political preferences that circulate and so forth, there's always some question about how access is organized and how selection happens. So you look at those two sides of it, right? So the access can be organized in ways that are broader or narrower, right? And social media is very widespread. It's wide access. Some of the complaints that you just voiced or others that voice are, it's too wide. We got a lot of dumb messages coming along with the intelligent ones, or it's too open to manipulation, or it's too open to Russian automation intervening and repeating the wrong messages or something. So we've got an access question, then we got a selection question. How do we vet this for quality? And we have this again, every kind of media. We've got it again now with this medium. How do we make judgments? What's the better housekeeping seal of approval that says you should believe the messages on this platform more than you believe the messages on that platform? Or on any one platform, you should believe this person? Or how do you judge that? ChatGPT and the new AI-based media raise this again. How do you tell the difference between a sincere expression of somebody's opinion and somebody telling a automated system to generate an opinion for them? And the techniques have to be learned, right? So that it takes some learning. Now, learning implies that there is some scale of quality. You can be better or worse at it. I like to use sports analogies, not just because I follow sports, but because it reminds us that it's not only in the realm of intellectual life that we have variations in performance, right? But the variations in performance may or may not be linked up well to the access and selection system. So if you say that in order to become a pro basketball player, you have to have been an amateur basketball player for 4 years in college, you have just biased the selection for your future NBA players in a way that is going to work against those people who don't have the resources or opportunities to go to college. And you've tilted it in favor of some other people. Well, we've gradually undone the old amateur restriction. We've said you can turn pro earlier. We've got different rules in different sports, right? Baseball never had the college rule the way that basketball did, and so forth. But what that reminds us is that you can have different systems, different institutional structures governing access. We probably don't want access to our political process restricted only to graduates of elite universities. Both that wouldn't be democratic because it would exclude a lot of people, and it would probably select people on an unfortunately biased basis, right? It would select them, we know, on the basis of money because money helps you get to elite universities. It would select them on the basis of family background because some people's parents are urging them to study at every stage of school and get the credentials to get into selective programs after that. And other people's parents aren't doing that for one reason or another. And we don't think these are very democratic selection criteria. So the issue isn't whether there will be some selectivity, right? The issue is whether the selectivity is working in a good or a bad, a biased or a helpful way, whether it is identifying qualities that we value, but also, and this is an important kicker, whether there's just too much of it, whether it's too unequal. Right? So if I tell you it's really hard to get into Princeton, it's true. And we can have a big debate about whether the criteria used are fair. Do they discriminate against some people? But we could also have a discussion of, is the issue that the gap between what Princeton gives you and what other less rich and selective universities give you is too big? And what we ought to have is strong state universities, strong opportunities in other institutions, so that the difference between Princeton and the others isn't so great. We would be better off with less inequality and more opportunity, but still with institutions that value learning, performance, quality, that help to educate people to be good judges of the information they're provided in newspapers, on TV, or in social media, that help people discriminate between conspiracy theories that don't have any very good basis in reality and the genuine problems that may emerge, or the occasions when they're lied to by leaders, which we also want them to be alert to and critical about. But that takes some genuine education, takes a wider access than the current very narrow access to elite education, and it takes selectivity on the right criteria.
So everything you're saying right here, I couldn't stop. First, when we were talking about kind of media and sort of the array of things that pop up and how huge a landscape it is. But then even also as you were concluding, talking about these universities, what they produce, I could not stop thinking about the way the concept of freedom is discussed in the book. And it's also because it's a thing I've become a little obsessed with lately, which is how we think about freedom, what it means to think seriously about freedom in the 21st century, and what it means. You all describe it as a positive fullness of life choices, and I think that's excellent. And I couldn't get away from that notion, even as we were talking about is there too much out there? Even if you're just thinking about content, it's like, well, people like having choices, and for better or worse, I think I probably do tend, even in something as kind of maybe sometimes shallow as a kind of debate about our media landscape. I do think I tend towards the more is better, because I think more stuff from more people is usually good, and in the long run. And I also think that what you're saying towards the end here is this idea about universities and meritocracy. A lot of what we're discussing is sort of the stages at which people's set of choices are consistently narrowed, right? Because if you don't have a point where, if you don't have institutions that can, if the only way to get ahead is Princeton and Harvard, it's a really narrow funnel you have to walk through. Absolutely. And if you don't walk through that path, that gate, then your sort of tree of your decision tree in life becomes incredibly trimmed down in terms of what you can do. And that's a huge problem, right? We don't want every decision point for people to be this place where, if you can't take the sort of most kind of advantageous route, then every other option sort of completely narrows down in front of you, right? And that's a scary thing. I mean, I went to graduate school at NYU precisely because I was afraid of that. I was a kid from Arkansas. I did undergrad in Arkansas. I didn't go to a bad college or anything, but I understood that there was a sense in which my options were much more limited until I got into one of those kinds of places. And that was when I wanted to be an academic more directly. And that was like a harrowing, I feel fortunate, and there's more luck involved than people will happily admit in those processes. But there was a nerve-wracking period, because there was a part of me that was like, if this doesn't, if I can't find entry into one of these kind of places, then I do have fewer options, because that is just how this is set up right now.
Yes, it is. That's a problem. And it's gotten, in certain ways, narrower. I mean, it's a really complicated story, and we get us into a long conversation, different long conversation about college and hierarchy and admissions.
Right.
So there are ways in which college admissions has been opened up. We have things that were, schools that were closed to women are more open to women. We've had programs to try to bring in more minorities. We have scholarships to help people who can't afford to pay tuition. So there are certain ways in which they've gotten more open. But there are other hidden kinds of closure, and you're pointing to some of them. It used to be that for highly selective graduate schools to go to medical school, one of the top medical schools in the country or something, you could do well at a whole lot of different undergraduate programs, right? You could be in Little Rock, you could be in Montana, you could be in North Carolina. And if you did really well in your undergraduate work, you had a shot at then the graduate school at the top medical school and becoming a distinguished doctor, right? All of the top medical schools have cut back the number of graduates they take from less prestigious colleges and universities. And less prestigious is sort of correlated with less selective. What they're doing is saying at every stage, there's going to be selection. Who got to be in the undergraduate program? And then that will determine who gets taken seriously for the medical school, the law school, business school, whatever it is. And so at every stage of your career, the ability you have to change the outcome by your hard work and by your intellectual performance is reduced because people are going to judge you by where you were, not how you did.
Exactly. I would almost describe it as like a selectivity nuclear arms race. I mean, you see these rates of admissions at some of these schools dropping down to like 4.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was graduate school, but I remember when I was at NYU, I think the undergraduate or general sort of admissions rate was something in like the low 30s. And I got, I get the emails and everything as an alum now, and they're like, this most recent year was 8%.
Yep.
I find that to be an absolute. I get these emails and they're celebratory, and I read them and I find it to be catastrophic.
Right. So I'm with you, and that bothers me, that the goal for private universities is that way. It bothers me even more when this is what's happening to our great state universities. So one of the things America did that made it more effective as a democracy was to build wonderful public universities that provided excellent education at very low cost, sometimes even free, to a mixture of the students in their states. Right. So true in Arkansas, true, Berkeley and UCLA, Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, and Virginia. These were pioneers of a kind of literally public education, where public didn't just mean the state sponsored it. It meant that it helped to make a public of the educated people in that state, because people came from all different parts of that state and they mixed with each other, knew each other through that university. They learned about issues. They also learned professions and went on to work for the state. So the universities were set up in a way that advanced the public good and advanced the sense among the citizens of being part of a common public, able to discuss things with each other. So some of them went back to small towns, and some of them were in big cities, and some of them moved out of state, but they had a common basis in their shared education. Now, this has changed. Partly there are more branch campuses, and the higher ed part's gotten complex because of scale again. But partly the flagship state universities started being more and more selective, so that you didn't have to be just a good high school graduate. You had to be an A student. And you had not just an A student, but an A student who could afford to study full time, because they became more discouraging of working while you're going to school. And they became more competitive. So they were recruiting more and more people to have an ability to compete with the elite private universities. So Michigan wasn't just saying, oh, we're about the public good of Michigan. It was saying, no, we want to be just as prestigious as Harvard, or at least as prestigious as Duke. And therefore, we're going to be highly selective, and we're going to build a research enterprise, and we're going to reduce the extent to which we build that public of people in Michigan. And versions of that went on in lots of states. And those universities compete with each other for position in the rankings, and they compete with each other for how well their graduates do getting into law school or graduate school of various kinds at other universities. And so it creates this arms race, exactly as you're saying, that gets tied up with a whole bunch of things that aren't integral to so-called merit, right? So in order to attract those students who have lots of choices, they're building fantastic athletic facilities and luxury dormitories. And there's an arms race in facilities. In order to fund those facilities, they're dependent on a class of billionaires who are giving them donations, but they're also raising the tuition so that it's not as expensive to go to Michigan or Berkeley as it is to go to Harvard or Princeton, but it's much too close. It's nowhere near the time when they used to be just about free, right? And so you've created a filter, a selection system that is based partly on the ability of parents to support their students in that competition to be selected as A students. That's based partly on wealth itself, that you can pay the tuition. That's based on feeling like you will fit in, because as they become more elitist, the person from the small rural town begins to think, I don't know, will I fit in? I want to go to local university because those people off in Ann Arbor or Berkeley are not going to accept me for who I am, right? And even more extreme, those people in Princeton or Cambridge, Massachusetts, or wherever. And so you've introduced, even while you've made the higher education system bigger, you've introduced a lot more hierarchy into it. And then one last feature that has to be mentioned, you've kind of hinted at it in your story about this, is that hierarchy gets presented as though there's just one value. You're just higher or lower on this thing called merit or quality, rather than that there are different options. So higher education in America grew up with church colleges, some of which were devoted to missions, some of which less focused on missions. It grew up with metropolitan universities in cities that were supported by the kind of town fathers of those cities to be part of advancing the economy and the future of that town, and also building democratic capacity in it. The universities had different emphases. Some of them were more technology oriented, and some of them were more arts and humanities oriented. What we've done is collapse a lot of that diversity into just hierarchy. Now, what does that do to choice? You have freedom to choose your college, but you're constrained by whether you got all A's or not. You're constrained by where you came from. You're constrained by how much money you have to pay for it. And you don't have the variety of choices because the way we organize the hierarchical competition just allowed for higher and lower as the standards of variation. Not so much. This is a more conservative school. This is a more religious school. This is a more activist school. And you can choose on those bases. Here's a school where everybody works, right? Berea College in Kentucky, where the part of the model is the church school, the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ is involved. But the Berea people are saying, we think that a good education should involve working for the common good while you are studying. So that's both a way of dealing with the cost problem and a positive value on a certain kind of education. But you've got very few schools with that structure because we've built this one-size-fits-all hierarchy, which is just claiming that the higher ones are better, but are at the same thing. Choice is being reduced, ironically. So there's freedom in the sense that nobody is blocking you outright, right? But the ability to make the choices that are going to be meaningful to you is being undermined. And versions of that happen in the rest of the economy. So I think we have quite a lot of freedom. We sort of, among the democratic values, freedom is the one that Americans have most seized on, or most focused on. And we should remember some of the other democratic values. We can come back to that. But we also need to think of freedom. Freedom for what, right? Is freedom just you've got an infinite number of breakfast cereals you can choose from in the supermarket? Or do you have freedom to make different choices in the basic institutions that are going to structure your life, right? If you're in a small town where the local schools been consolidated and somebody said, well, in order to get a few of our kids into more selective colleges, we have to collapse all of the schools into one, and students will come from 30 miles around to go to that one high school. If you come from a town where they've closed the local hospital because they say, well, we should really have viability. American healthcare has been transformed by a kind of capitalist structure of chains, right? It's like chain stores. You don't have a local Main Street that has an independent shoe store and an independent restaurant and an independent, store of every other kind. You've got a variety of chains, and on the outskirts, you've got Walmart. We've done sort of the same thing to education, to healthcare, to other arenas. And that leaves us with the right to choose freely, but with no possibility of exercising that right in many of the most meaningful aspects of our lives because the choices just aren't there.
I have on this, I think, like a slight pivot, but I think it is actually very thematically consistent with what you've been discussing, because I wanted to get to it, and you alluded to these other democratic values here at the end, which is this relationship, I think, between freedom and public virtue, and also solidarity, which is to say, I've long been a believer that you can't constrain, that a lot of what is required to create virtuous citizens is essentially a relatively free environment, and that you can't really make people be good, at least in a coercive way. Now, you should have protections, right? You should have protections against egregious kinds of misconduct like discrimination, right, and workplace mistreatment and things like that, right? You want protections, but that's not the same as sort of you can't really, you can't, I think, build virtue fully into law in the way that some people might imagine. But one of the things that I think is interesting running throughout the book and this conversation we're having, and then I just think about in general, looking at the kind of landscape we're living in today, is this kind of, like you also allude to, this impoverished way of thinking about freedom is merely a kind of economic thing. And there's a lot of value in a good bit of economic freedom, people having the ability to do certain things and trade, and those things are important. But if it's reduced to that, if it's simplified to that, we miss, right, and overlook a lot of other kinds of full and rich understandings of what it means to be free. I think a lot about, even in your sense of the discussions around solidarity, we talk about freedom of association in the United States. How free are we to associate when we live in an increasingly atomized lives, where we don't have these options, where entry into so many aspects of society requires these, as we've already discussed, participation in these highly selective institutions? Well, actually, there's a lot of things making it hard for us to freely associate and build bonds with one another the way we ought to be able to do. And I think that's an incredibly damaging thing for us, in terms of, and I think that's important because while I think that you can't top down coercively create public virtue, I do very much believe that the ability to form connections and bonds with other people does foster virtue in individuals, because it's so linked to things like empathy and solidarity and concern for things outside of ourselves, like public things.
Right. So virtue is really key, and first I want to emphasize is that if we think virtue is important, we might ask whether we're selecting for virtue when we select congressmen or presidents, when we select media personalities who are going to have a big influence, when we select who gets into college or who gets big, high-paying corporate jobs? And I think the answer is we're not very much. We're selecting sometimes for technical skill. We might be selecting for family background. Maybe there are biases of race or gender or whatever. But even if it's not those kinds of biases, we've narrowed the criteria of selection to be a certain kind of academic performance, a certain kind of capacity to present yourself that is more common among the kids who get to go to certain elite suburban schools and private schools than it is everywhere, and technical prowess, right? If we're serious about virtue, ought to think of that as part of what we select for, and part of why democracy is open to a wider range of people than just the rich or just the highly educated. Because we really want good citizens, and that virtue comes widely. Now, where does that virtue come from? Well, it's learned partly. I mean, there may be innate components, but it's partly learned. It's learned in families. It's learned in communities. If we destroy local communities, if everybody is commuting to work or working online, if every time you go shopping, you're ordering from Amazon, you're not actually rubbing shoulders with any of your neighbors in a local store or walking down Main Street, if religion declines or the practice of religion isn't as much solidaristic in particular congregations, we are losing the places where we would learn virtue, because you learn virtue in relations with other people in large part. Now, yes, you may read Cicero and other great books, right? But you also discuss with other people, with your friends. You learn virtue in the Boy Scouts. You learn virtue in a variety of clubs you may join, service organizations. Do you join an organization that works locally for a better community, whether you're talking about being a student and joining a club in school, you're talking about things like Lions and Rotary and these kind of organizations. All of that has declined in American society. All of those places where people would learn virtue by participating with other people in community have declined. So that's part of why I'm worried, and we're worried in this book, that while we have celebrated freedom, we haven't celebrated some other things that we also value, because most of us do value virtue, and we do value community and family. And if we've allowed society to undermine the foundations of our solidarities, then we're in big trouble. Think of, just as a non-obvious example, how much work historically meant working with other people in a place, craft work or a factory or an office. What does it mean if it gets redefined logistically so that it's not with other people in the same degree, right? And you can then go on in a variety of other examples of this and see that we've lost it. One of my favorite examples, and I think I and others my generation are complicit, who reacted to some of the genuine problems of the Vietnam War era and to the experience that the draft was coercive, by saying, no, we want freedom. We want to get the ROTC off campus. We want to end the draft. Military should be all volunteer. Well, what do you get? You get very few rich people volunteering. You get military service being restructured as a sort of caste-like thing where people in some families go into it, restructured on the basis of for whom it's a good job opportunity, right? Instead of going to college or because they don't have higher paying opportunities. And it can be a great boost. The military then can give you some education. It can give you skills, which maybe can translate into the civilian opportunities later, although we see that our ability to incorporate our returning veterans is pretty problematic, right? But what we've done is end military service as something that brought all Americans from different walks of life, different parts of the country together, right? It used to be that you got to know people from different places, in part because you served together in the military. And we kind of reduced that, right? If we went to saying, okay, we're going to have national service, and it can be military, it can be healthcare, it can be, working in different ways, but everybody in the country is going to come together, it would feel coercive, because that would be telling people who are 18 or 20 or however old you're setting it at that they have to do it. It's not just free. But it would be very good for our national solidarity for people to be doing some things together with Americans in different walks of life, Americans who come from different backgrounds, right? You wouldn't be ending all inequality. You wouldn't be eliminating every judgment of differential merit, but you would be creating more mixing, and more mixing would be a good thing.
To bring it back to take what you just said and bring it forward a few decades to the very current moment and say, I want to put to you, I guess, how much do you think about something like January 6th as a sort of explosion of this kind of failure of social solidarity and virtue? Because I certainly, I think increasingly we've seen a lot of sort of really great deep dive reporting and stories about individuals where it's not so much, one angle was sort of economic anxiety, and it's not really so much straightforwardly that, but I do see a lot of people who pulled away from their local communities, pulled away from their families, or pulled away from their friends, and increasingly sought community in these more atomized locations and places, in online forums, in this sort of particular virulent version, right, of politics, this sort of going to Trump rallies, or even just kind of, various social media applications. And, to me, it feels like, and I'm not trying to remove, like we're discussing, freedom is important, individual agency is important. I am not absolving individuals who participated in this event, but I am suggesting that right, as we, I think, are both saying, your social ties have a big role to play in who you become and in virtue, but they can also, to echo the title of your book, they can also be, in the same way that they can instill and inculcate virtue in a person, they can also be degenerative. They can create cycles of vice as well. Yeah. So I'm curious how you think about an event like that.
So there's the question of the event itself and the particular people, and then there's the question of the backdrop to it. So you can't understand the event without getting a sense of the polarization in American society, getting a sense of the anger people feel. Now, most of the people on one side or the other of polarization are not going to Washington on January 6th. Most of the people who are angry and feel left out or frustrated with the government do not decide that therefore they're going to go to Washington and they're going to carry weapons and that they're going to kill the guards at the Capitol or something like that, right? So I think that having a strong and sympathetic understanding of why people feel alienated and frustrated is really important. And the explanations of that are much wider than the explanations of why do some of those people, right, choose this, right? And I think that we've got to have a mix of explanations here for something like January 6th. Some of it is people who are really ideologically committed and joined with others in ideological organizations or went to a lot of websites associated with very extremist views, and got to be part of an ultra-right-wing movement. But we know that many of the people who went weren't very plugged into that ideological movement. Some people went because it sounded like an exciting thing to do. Hey, a bunch of us are going to Washington and we're going to show people that we want to take government back. Well, okay, sure, let's go. It'd be a fun trip, right? And it goes wrong. But you've got to recognize that there are some people who are deeply ideologically committed, some people who aren't. There are people who are into the show and the theater of it, right? They're dressing in bizarre ways. and calling attention to themselves. They're filming themselves, putting their feet on the speaker's desk, partly because they like insulting the institutions and the Speaker of the House, partly because they think it'll make a great video to show their friends or to post on the media, and that they will get some recognition and attention out of it. So the explanation has to be, why do they feel so needy for recognition and attention that they would try to get it in that way, which is not a political explanation, though it has political consequences. So the particular event, we've got to see different things going on in different biographical stories, how we get there. Then we've got to see the way in which some ideologically and politically motivated people stimulate this and steer it and push it in one direction or another, either as agent provocateur or as people giving a speech just before it and saying things like, we've got to take back the Capitol, we've got to charge, or we've got to hang Mike Pence, or whatever it is, right? So there are some people who have an outsized influence. They may not even show up on the steps of the Capitol or break down the doors, but they were urging people on to do that, right? And that's part of the explanation. So, any particular event's always got a bunch of things going on around it. What maybe worries me as much as anything is the contempt for the law and the institutions. I think we don't have any choice in a large, complex society like ours, but to have institutions, including legal and law enforcement institutions. And so what you saw on January 6th was people, some of whom were veterans, some of whom came from law enforcement, who in other circumstances might have been saying, I believe that we ought to defend the military and law enforcement and the idea that America is a law-abiding society, going out there with contempt for the laws, contempt for the police, killing guards, right? Putting the military in danger, because their contempt for the institutions was stronger than their solidarity with the people who served in those institutions. We need institutions that people feel some solidarity with. If they don't work well, we've got to fix how they work so that that solidarity can be justified. But we can't survive just as a whole bunch of individuals, maybe forming some online networks so that they know where to show up for the next rally, but not feeling an investment in our institutions or an investment in community and solidarity. And so that's what worries me. And the same thing goes to the voting issue and all of the ways in which people are willing to undermine the electoral process in order to win. And right now, that's mostly the far right, but sometimes it's the left too. And the point is, if you begin to value winning more than your investment in the democratic institutions of the country, we're in big trouble. That's the degeneration of democracy. And if you begin to value your side, just some abstract idea, as though this were just a sporting event and you had your team, the other people had their team, you want your team, the Trump team or the Biden team, to win, and you don't really think about the country and what we're trying to make as a shared way of life, then we're in big trouble.
Well, I could easily probe you for hours on end about all these topics, but I think that's also just a really excellent kind of summary and end point to that part of the conversation. So I now want to give you the chatter question I give everyone on this podcast, which is because we love a kind of focus on the out of the way and the away from, we call it's called the periphery, and because of Pulaski's preoccupations with place, I am curious to know, and you can give me, I know you live in Arizona now, you could give me some other place before Arizona that you lived if you want. If someone comes to, your neck of the wood or one of your necks of the wood that you feel attachment to, a place you'd recommend. It can be a cultural institution like a museum. It can be a state or national park. It can be a restaurant or bar you're in love with. But where you would send them that might not end up in the kind of Fodor's top 10 do this if you go to this place kind of thing.
So I'm going to give you a clear answer, and it's not where I'm from, it's where I live, right? So it would be a different answer if I tried to reflect on where I grew up or where I've lived the longest part of my life. I've lived in Arizona only 5 years. I like it. I feel a part of it. And that includes particular places. So I think your question is a good question because nobody inhabits their whole state seamlessly. They find places within it they really like and go back to. Just like nobody's friends with everybody. You have your network of friends. And so in Arizona, a place that I really like and I go back to over and over again, to which I take out-of-state visitors, is the Desert Botanical Garden. And that's partly because the desert is such a shaping influence on Arizona, the ecology in which we live. It's partly because the desert was a bit of a surprise to me when I moved to Arizona, because the desert is full of life. And my idea of a desert, shaped partly by reading and TV and partly by having lived at the edge of the Sahara Desert and visited the Gobi Desert and things like that, was the desert was empty. There'd be a lot of sand. Well, you go to the Sonoran Desert and it's very dry, it's arid, but there are lots of kinds of life there. There are birds, an abundance of birds. There are plants, from cacti to aloe to other sorts of plants. There's the history of the Native Americans who lived there. And so this sense of the desert as a setting for life seems a really nice thing to me. And as a setting for beauty, because I don't think I really had ever thought about the fact that cacti bloomed and made flowers before I went there. And not just the cacti, right? That this desert has a spring full of flowers, that it has seasons. So the Desert Botanical Garden to me is a great place to get a feeling for the ecology that shapes where we live in Arizona. It'd be different if we're in the far north and it were more mountainous, or different if we're in other states. But this is distinctive and it helps make the place, right? The place is this place in the desert. And it also is a balance to the fact that Greater Phoenix is a giant urban sprawl. And you could easily go from resort to shopping mall to strip mall and not have a sense of the place except of this urban conurbation, not have a sense of the environment. And so I like going to the Desert Botanical Garden. I also like the fact that it grew up with the city. It was founded in the early 20th century, along with a lot of other institutions. We were talking about colleges earlier. A lot of them were founded then. That grew up because there were some public-spirited people who wanted to appreciate their environment, but also wanted to make a better community. So it has a founder and then a group of people who build it, and then you can still join and you become a donor, but you can also volunteer. And so creating the Desert Botanical Garden really was part of creating the whole community that it's a part of there in Phoenix. And then last but not least, it's a good place to eat. Because they have a good restaurant, but also a restaurant that serves things that are related to the plants that grow in the desert, right? And that use cactus as an ingredient or things like that. So that's where I take people when I want them to appreciate the place where I live.
Well, I'm completely sold. I've never been to the sort of desert, the really great desert parts of the United States in Arizona or Nevada or New Mexico, but I really want to go. And so
okay, come visit, Alan.
Yeah, you've got me even more. It's kind of been one of those things where I've been slowly building up a kind of strong urge, and now that you're only increasing it. The book is Degenerations of Democracy. Craig Calhoun co-authored with Dilip, Parameshwar Gaonkar and Charles Taylor. Craig Calhoun is a University Professor of Social Sciences at Arizona State University and a member of the board here at the Pulaski Institution. Craig, it's really just such a joy, and I mean this like as someone who has read your work and followed you from a young student, an honor to get to work with you. So thanks so much for coming on.
Well, you're a generous spirit, Alan. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, have a great day. The Periphery is a production of the Pulaski Institution. I've been your host, Alan Elrod. Our music was written, recorded, and produced by Brandon Ragsdale and Cody Smith. Thank you for coming, and please join us next time.